Sure. That's a big question because everybody's different. I think
Yeah.
the first thing I try to get people to do is have fun.
Yeah.
Find content that makes them happy. Find content that grabs their concentration to where the learning process is a joy. It's fun. It's something you look forward to.
Yeah, and I'll be asking you some more questions that I believe that my audience will need. And for people who are not in USA or in speaking country, here in Rwanda, we speak French and English, but even people who do go to school, they can't speak English that well. That is why, like, having someone who is doing input English, they can benefit a lot from you, because sometimes they can read, they can write English, but when it comes to speaking, it's a challenge. What do you have for them? What's the advice can you tell them that they need to do? And what is the importance of input English?
Sure. That's a big question because everybody's different. I think
Yeah.
the first thing I try to get people to do is have fun.
Yeah.
Find content that makes them happy. Find content that grabs their concentration to where the learning process is a joy. It's fun. It's something you look forward to.
Yeah.
What you described of studying by traditional methods plays out all over the world. When I was doing research for the US government years ago, I had a Japanese researcher write me a letter, and it was written perfectly. It was grammatically perfect, and he asked if he could visit my laboratory and spend a week with me. Of course, I said yes, and he came 6 months later. So I studied a bunch of polite phrases in Japanese so that I could be a better host. Now, when he arrived, I did not speak Japanese.
Yeah.
But I had enough polite phrases that he was stunned. He was absolutely surprised. But he went on to explain to me that he studied English throughout his whole education. He had a doctorate level education, and he could read and write English, but he couldn't speak it, and he couldn't understand native content. So he is an anecdote. He is one person, one set of observations, but I see that theme playing out all over the world. He, like many people, he is smart. He is well educated, but the methods that he was using to learn English were not effective to attain fluency.
Yeah.
They were effective to give him a big vocabulary. They were effective for him to write correspondence, but he couldn't watch a television series. And I had to slow down my speaking cadence quite a bit so that he could follow our conversations one-on-one. I think looking at your channel and looking at my channel, we're doing the same thing in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
One of the things I see in your channel is a tremendous amount of joy, enthusiasm, positiveness, and that draws people in. I think that is unbelievably powerful. You're trying to give people a grip on the English language, and if they're starting from zero or not being able to understand much, they have to have some way to get a grip on it. And so I see you're doing that.
Yes.
You and I are both trying to build a bridge so that the learners can use our content, devour our content, and then go out and use native content to bring themselves to the next level.
Yes, I agree with you on what you're saying. And when you are learning, it should be a joy. And there's this philosophy that I adopted when you want to learn English. You have to learn as you relax and relax as you learn. You should find joy in learning. It shouldn't stress you out. And if you want to learn, you might listen to songs that you like. And if you like movies, I think at some point you can use them. And you can even use like podcasts for like using your channel. And that is something that I believe that can help people learn so well. Yes, I think knowing the basics, that is something that is good. But again, after knowing the basics, it's how you are exposing yourself to the language. Because at the end of the day, we speak what we listen, okay? And if you listen to good English, like your input, you're going to end up being able to speak English. That is why I asked you that question, because most people, they go to school, they read English, and they write English, as you've said, but they can't speak English. And I found that it's kind of like, even when you are lifting weights and you are using only your hands are gonna be strong, but I don't think that your legs are gonna be strong. So then if you're learning and you want to be able to speak, you should work on your listening, and your listening, it's how you're exposing yourself to the language, and even that's gonna help you to be able to speak. And that's why I really agree with what you're saying. I adopted this, what you're doing. I started listening to BBC and then changed to VOA. And I realized it was helping me a lot. Now I started to listen to songs and get the message. So I said, these things work. And when I came to your channel, I didn't know about input English. When I came to your channel, I said, oh, and I had to do research about that. I've been following you for a while. So I was so happy when you accepted my invitation, and it's really a pleasure having you here. And I want to ask you next question. For people who are intermediate, and I think those are people that you're teaching, apart from using input, what do you think that they need to be doing?
More input. So yeah. I am heavily influenced by the work of Stephen Krashen.
Yeah.
He's an emeritus professor from USC here in California. And he is the fellow who coined the term input, hypothesis, input, comprehensible input. And he's been very influential. One of his students, his disciples, Beniko Mason, is in Japan, and she ran with it. And she created and popularized story listening. She emphasized the need for input and using stories. Think about it, the world over, we as a species are storytellers.
Yeah.
Our history is handed down. We tell our children about our forefathers. We are storytellers, and it's not an accident that language is absorbed with these stories, because storytelling and language developed in human history in parallel. They're integral. So Beniko Mason developed story listening, very influential on me. I've never met her. I've just studied her work. And then there was an interesting fellow, Marvin Brown, who is an American academic with a PhD from Yale in linguistics. And his area was of interest, his area of interest was the languages of Thailand and that portion of the world. So when he got his degree, he looked for an opportunity and wound up in Bangkok. And he signed on as a teacher at the AUA school. The AUA school still exists. When he got there, he was full of all these ideas of making better material and better exercises and better ways of teaching by traditional methods.
Yeah.
And when he applied his work in that school, it failed horribly. So he, instead of just quitting and crying, he said, oh, maybe I'm doing this wrong. So they, in that school, developed a method of teaching people that was 100% input for about 1,000 hours. And the students would come in for 4 hours a day, sit in the classroom, and two teachers would act out. They would hit each other with toys. They would scream at each other. They would pour water on each other. They would make jokes. They did everything to make the people laugh.
Yeah.
And they used a boatload of language, and the people learned it. So these are my influences. Marvin Brown wrote a lot about his approach to input, and, to a fault, because what I didn't see in all this literature about input learning methods is how to switch to output, how to start speaking. Pablo Roman is he's the fellow who invented Dreaming Spanish, and he's a brilliant guy who's helped me learn Spanish very well. And what he said was, well, you need a couple 100 hours practicing to speak, and the language just comes out of you if you've had enough input. So I think, one of the things I really liked about your channel was one of your videos, you made a big point. If you're looking for a get fluent quick 30 days program, go away. This is not that. So the thing that boils out of your channel is absolute honesty. So I think in terms of people, if they're learning a similar language to English, I'll be specific. If they're learning from a native language of German, French, Spanish, Italian, Dutch, it's probably going to take them 1,500 or 2,000 hours of input to where they will be super comfortable and be able to speak in the community without trauma. If somebody is coming to English from a very different language, such as Kinyarwanda, for instance, it's probably going to take 1.5 times more effort. Now, there's an exception, and that is your students are in a country that's already teaching the basics. It doesn't take into account the starting point. So, but the point I'm making slowly and badly is it takes a lot more input than a lot of people think.
I agree with you. And some people, they even make ads that they can teach people English for 3 months. You can be you can be speaking with, and people, they buy those stories, telling them that they are going to learn English in short time. That's why even people call me, they tell me, I need it so fast, I want you to teach. And even my channel is called Learning Fast, but I tell them it's called Learning Fast, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to teach you English just 3 months. That is not possible. Talking about that, how long do you think it can take a person to be able to master a language? Let's say to communicate well, fluently. How long should that person learn? Because I want to make it clear, because most people, they need to know this. They ask this question.
Right. That's quite a puzzle because
Yeah, it's a puzzle, I know, but we can talk about it.
So let's start teasing out some details. One we've already talked about, and that is their starting point. Because
Yeah.
if they already have a large vocabulary of words in their
Yes.
head, then they'll have a better grip on the input and it won't take as long.
Yeah.
So for that person, if they've already been watching some popular media and they're catching things off of popular culture, maybe they're going to be 1,500 hours and be very happy with the change that has occurred in them. If somebody's starting from zero, they're going to need more than that.
Yeah.
The other thing is it's traditional for people to talk about how many years they studied a language.
Yeah.
2 years. I took 3 years. But if, for instance, with me, I studied German for 2 years, but it was 1 hour a day, 180 days a year for 2 years. So I had less than 400 hours of input, and most of those classes were not input. They were diagramming verbs.
Yes.
And so I had almost no input. And yet I credited myself for having 2 years studied English.
Yeah.
Well, when I got to Austria, I couldn't buy groceries. I couldn't talk to people about anything. But when I was on the ground in Austria, in the restaurants, in the university, in the stores, I would talk to people in English, and maybe they understood, maybe they didn't, but they would talk to me in German, and maybe I would understand, and maybe I didn't.
Yeah.
But I turned my 3 months in Austria into this gigantic language exchange. So I learned more in 3 months living in Austria because of the cooperation I got from those people, as compared to the 2 years that I took in school.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that if you want to learn a language, it's just how you're going to put your input, and you've learned, you've written English, you know some words. If you do that, you're gonna have a short time with input. And if you're going to start, are you gonna need to have some time to write English and read English and then put input later, or they should all go together?
Again, I am not a guru. I'm just an honest guy trying to communicate, trying to make resources, but I don't want to come across as some professor who has invented something special.
Yeah.
I am really quoting the work of Marvin Brown and Stephen Krashen, and our influence here is input. And so what I was taught, what I believe, and what worked for me is to listen to 1,000 hours before you read. That is not a one-size-fits-all and everything else is wrong. I'm not dogmatic. I'm just telling you where the influence is in my journey.
Yeah, I agree with you, because as children, we learn to speak before we can be able to lead. We can be able to listen to a language and be able to speak it before we are able to lead it and write it.
Right.
Yeah. And that's why, for me, I even believe that if it was possible for you, it would be better that you could expose yourself to more listening. But I believe that reading plays a part as well.
Oh, a huge part. You're absolutely right. So it's funny, I have these funny little mental images of how this puzzle fits together, and I don't label the pattern that I have as universally true. It's just a pattern that allows me to function. And so the first part of the puzzle for me is input by listening, and that gives me the sounds of the language.
Yes.
And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. It's a funny little dumb story.
Yeah.
And then once you've got the sounds of the language in your head, then you can start reading. And my mental image is that reading gives you a very clear picture of the grammar, and it builds vocabulary as good or better than listening. So my 1-2 punch for a language, as taught to me, is listen to a lot on the order of 1,000 hours, and then read a lot, another 1,000 hours.
Yes.
And the next thing you know, you've got a very big mental image of that language. Now, when we are switching between very disparate languages, we get into things like alphabets. So if I was going to try to learn Russian or Japanese, one of my big obstacles I would have to overcome, or Chinese for that matter, would be to learn the completely different alphabet. But if you don't read and write the language, you can still understand and speak. There are people all over the world, we call them illiterate. That doesn't always mean bad things, because a 5-year-old is frequently illiterate, but they can speak with good grammar, and they can be understood, and they can communicate. So it's really a matter of what people want. If the language learner wants to be able to understand English, for instance, they should just listen to a lot of English that's fairly easy to understand. You touched on this earlier. We are taught to struggle, but certainly with comprehensible input, struggling actually decreases your efficiency, slows down the process, and increases the probability that you'll get frustrated and quit.
Yeah, I have even some students in USA who are from Rwanda. They reach out and I teach them, but here's the problem. Sometimes I teach them, but they tell me that they are busy, but they can't listen to English. They just only come when I'm gonna teach them. And I tell them, you need to be listening to English. If you're not listening to English, if you're not reading English, what I'm doing, it will not end up helping you, however busy you are. If you want to learn a language, just have your time using it, reading it, listening to the language, and listen to something that makes you happy. That's what I'm telling them. And even when I reached to your channel, I said, this is what I am telling my student every time. That's why I liked you a lot, and I've been listening to your videos, the messages you are giving, and I found so helpful to my audience. And I will be suggesting them to go out and look at your channel. And I believe that people are being helped by you, and you yourself, you can even see in the comments, we need that. We need that. Thank you so much for taking initiative to start that channel. And how did you decide to start a channel?
Well, it's indirectly because of the pandemic.
Okay, yeah.
So the pandemic disrupted things, and we in California could not do all the stuff we wanted to do.
Yes.
So even though we were still busy, we had some time on our hands.
Yeah.
And I looked at that. I remembered a story that was told to me years earlier. Isaac Newton, the mathematician in England, was sequestered, was quarantined during a plague epidemic. And during that, he basically invented calculus. And I'm no Isaac Newton, but I was aware of that story that this fellow repurposed the time for his quarantine period and did something useful. So instead of watching television, cooking shows, and I said, well, maybe I'll find something else. So I actually started reading literature in English, but great literature, big works of English language literature or translated into English during the pandemic. So I read War and Peace, Anna Karenina, the Brothers Karamazov, Moby Dick, and I was reading a book a month.
You were reading a book a month?
Right. But it was in English. But what it taught me was how to repurpose my time, how to set a goal and put it into the day to where instead of getting up and wasting a bunch of time, I would get up and get some coffee and listen to an hour on a book or read an hour in a book. And so that experience during the early pandemic allowed me to learn how to stop wasting time on nonsense and start, cleaning up my day so that I would have some real time to do something worthwhile. And during that experience, a fellow in England named Benjamin McAvoy, Ben has a channel on YouTube that helps people find and understand the great literature in English. And he was the curator of the list of books that I wound up devouring. And he said, so you've read Don Quixote? And I'm thinking, yeah, I did. And he said, you liked it, didn't you? I thought, yeah. I'm talking to a screen. It's silly. But he said, well, if you liked it in English, you'd probably love it in Spanish. He said, if you find a great piece of translated literature, there's a point at which you might want to learn the language and enjoy it in the original language. Now, that didn't turn out to be very useful specifically because Don Quixote was written in a very old version of Spanish. But that suggestion was an idea. It was a spark. And that spark caught fire. And I thought, when I was living in Austria, they said, what is trilingual? And I said, you speak 3 languages. They said, right. Yeah. What is bilingual? And I said, that would be someone who speaks 2 languages.
Yeah.
And what is monolingual? And I said, 1 language. And they said, no, that's an American. So the challenge was thrown down in my past. And so here I am during the pandemic with a spark of an idea. Why don't you learn Spanish?
Yes.
So I went on to YouTube and I put in I went on to Google and I put in the search window comprehensible input because I had heard that term, but I didn't know what it meant.
Yes.
I didn't know what it meant. And I wanted to wrap my head around what that was and was it useful? I intuitively figured that it was because when I came back from Austria a long time ago, 35 years ago, when I came back to the States, having studied in Austria, I was looking for videos in German that I could watch to build my German. I just couldn't find them because back in that era, the German teaching was all grammar and vocabulary. It was all traditional methods. So with the finding of comprehensible input, I found Stephen Krashen. I found Steve Kaufman. You probably know Steve Kaufman, who invented LINK. And I used LINK. LINK is useful for reading in many languages and following the audio in parallel. So I have read a lot of Spanish where it was being spoken and I was following in the transcript. So Link is useful for that. And Link was also useful for accessing some podcasts and finding good podcasts. And so I wound up using Link as a tool to find other resources. One of the resources I found through Link was Dreaming Spanish. Pablo Roman is a very clever fellow who has a paid Spanish site with 5,712 videos and counting. They make 4 or 5 a day.
Oh my goodness.
His channel is amazing. It's not expensive. And I have listened to and watched 1,000 hours of Spanish on that channel.
1,000 hours.
That's plus the 1,000 hours of audiobooks and podcasts.
Yeah.
So I've done 2,000 hours of Spanish. This is not bragging. This is the work I did in just under 2 years.
Which I'm planning to study Spanish, and I'm gonna need to do that. Now we would like to get to the conclusion, but before we wrap up, I still need you to conclude. We are remaining with like only 2 minutes. You can conclude
Sure.
with the message to the audience.
In short, Pablo told me that we, in his content, that we need content in English, and I took the bait. So that's why the channel got built, the challenge for Pablo.
Yeah.
So to wrap up, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm honored. I look forward to lots more conversations in the future.
Sure.
If I can be of service, please let me know. And my message to your viewers is keep it fun and then just keep getting more input.
Yes, you get it. Keep it fun. Enjoy it. Learn as you relax and relax as you learn. We love you so much. Thanks, Joe.
See ya.
See you.